Welcome back to Talk Tickers, the show where we break down those earnings calls that are so packed with information, they make your head spin. Today, we're diving deep into Ford's Q4 2024 report.
It's a really interesting time to be looking at Ford, isn't it? You've got this massive shift to EVs happening, competition popping up all over the globe, and then, of course, that constant pressure to keep costs down and quality up.
Yeah, and this earnings call, this gives us a little sneak peek into how they're trying to manage all of that.
Exactly.
So let's start with the big news first, shall we? Ford just announced a record global revenue of $185 billion.
Their fourth year in a row with revenue growth.
That's right, 4 straight years. And of course, the F-Series is still America's top-selling vehicle. But we want to dig a little deeper than just those headlines, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to this story. I mean, Ford's making some pretty big strategic moves that are worth paying attention to.
So where do we even begin?
Well, how about we start with those powerhouse franchises they've got? I mean, the F-Series, Ranger, and Transit vans, they're all doing incredibly well.
Right.
And their commercial pro business is just booming, especially with those high-end Super Duty trucks and transit wagons.
So it sounds like they're making some smart choices about which models to really focus on.
Yeah, it's not just about selling more, right? It's about selling the right vehicles to maximize those profits.
Now, on top of that, they're also putting a ton of energy into closing the cost gap and boosting quality, which seems like a really tough balancing act.
It is, for sure, but it's essential if they want to stay competitive in this environment.
So what are they actually doing to make that happen?
Well, for starters, they've brought in some serious talent, top-notch people in their fields, and they've also got these third-party experts coming in to really scrutinize their processes.
Kind of like a fresh set of eyes.
Exactly, yeah, and they're putting a lot of effort into operational improvements, making things more efficient across the board.
And all of that is already starting to show some results, right? I mean, they managed to cut costs by $500 million in the second half of 2024 alone.
Yep, that's right. But they keep saying that's just the beginning. They've got a long-term plan for continuous improvement.
This is where it gets really interesting to me, though. How are they handling this crazy market we're in right now? I mean, competition in the EV space is just getting more intense. Prices are all over the place. Hybrid trucks are becoming more popular. And then you've got Chinese automakers expanding globally. It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and that's why this earnings call is so fascinating. We get to see how they're responding to all of this pressure.
All right, so let's take a look at their outlook for 2025 then. They're predicting an adjusted EBIT of somewhere between $7 billion and $8.5 billion, which, I mean, that sounds pretty decent on the surface, but there's a catch, right?
There is. They're basically saying those projections don't factor in any potential curveballs thrown by, policy changes, specifically tariffs.
So how big of a deal are these tariffs, really?
Well, Ford's saying that if it's just a short-term tariff situation, it wouldn't be a complete disaster. But if these things drag on, we're talking potentially billions of dollars in lost profits for the entire industry. And of course, higher prices for consumers too. So yeah, they're keeping a very close eye on this whole tariff situation.
Understandably so. Now let's zoom in on their EV strategy, because I think this is what a lot of people are really curious about. Ford seems to be putting a lot of emphasis on affordability and high-volume production, especially when it comes to those smaller and mid-sized trucks and SUVs.
Yes, they're calling that the sweet spot for the U.S. retail market, and their logic is pretty solid, I think.
Okay, break it down for us.
Well, first off, these kinds of vehicles, they're already super popular. They fit into most people's lifestyles, whether it's for commuting, running errands, you name it. And importantly, they don't need those massive, expensive batteries that the bigger EVs require.
Right, which is a huge factor in cost.
Exactly. So by focusing on smaller vehicles that need smaller batteries, Ford can actually offer these EVs at more affordable prices and attract a much wider range of buyers.
It makes a lot of sense, actually. But what about all the buzz surrounding those big, fancy electric SUVs? Is Ford just ignoring that whole segment?
Not exactly, no. They recognize that there's potential there, but they're being realistic about how affordable those really are for the average person.
Right.
I mean, those giant batteries, they make the manufacturing costs skyrocket, and that gets passed on to the consumer in the end.
Yeah, those price tags can be pretty intimidating.
So they're looking at some different options for that segment. Things like hybrids and something called EREVs, which stands for Extended Range Electric Vehicles. We're talking about vehicles that can go over 700 miles on a single tank of gas.
Okay, now that's interesting. Tell me more about these ERVs.
It's basically a clever way to appeal to people who aren't quite ready to go full EV, but they still want some of the benefits of electric driving, like that instant torque and silent operation.
But without the range anxiety.
Exactly. It's like a bridge between those two worlds, and it could be a really smart move for Ford.
So they're basically saying big SUVs, big range anxiety, big price tag, maybe not the best recipe for mass adoption.
Exactly. They see more potential for those large EVs in the commercial market where businesses, they're more focused on total cost of ownership and aren't as worried about those range limitations.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and dive into their plan for reducing costs. What are they focusing on here?
They're attacking it from multiple angles. First up, faster defect identification. They want to catch those problems early before they become major issues.
Preventative measures, basically.
Right. And then there's supplier collaboration. They're working really closely with their suppliers to make everything more streamlined.
So less waste, better quality overall.
Exactly. And they're also big on what they call complexity reduction, which basically means simplifying their designs and processes.
Less room for error.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are those OTA updates. That's over the air, by the way. So they can fix software issues and improve functionality remotely.
OTA updates, it's like magic.
Yeah.
So how many of those did they actually do in Q4?
A whopping 9 million. They pushed out 9 million OTA updates just in the fourth quarter alone.
Wow. Okay, so before we get bogged down in all the details of each segment, let's just step back and recap those key financial highlights. Give us the big picture.
All right, so they managed to achieve an adjusted EBIT of $10.2 billion with a 5.5% margin. That's pretty solid.
Not bad at all.
Plus, they generated $6.7 billion in adjusted free cash flow. And their balance sheet looks pretty good, too. Over $28 billion in cash on hand.
That's a nice cushion to have.
Oh, for sure. And they're committed to giving back 40% to 50% of that free cash flow to shareholders.
Always music to investors' ears. Okay, let's break things down by segment now, starting with Ford Pro, their commercial vehicle division. I mean, they just seem to be crushing it over there.
Oh, absolutely. Ford Pro is the star of the show right now. Their revenue jumped by 15%, hitting a whopping $67 billion.
Wow.
And they pulled in an EBIT of $9 billion with a 13.5% margin.
Those are some serious numbers. What's driving that success?
Yeah.
Is it just the popularity of those Super Duty trucks and transits, or is there more to it?
It's a combo platter, really. You're right, they've got a fantastic product lineup that seems to cover just about every need in the commercial world, but they're also really smart about how they leverage their dealer network and service capabilities.
They're not just making the sale, they're building relationships.
Exactly. It's all about that long-term customer loyalty.
Smart move.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Model E, their EV division. Now, they're facing some pretty stiff pricing pressure in that market, right?
They are. They've been really focused on cutting costs. They managed to save $1.4 billion last year, but they're still feeling the squeeze from the way pricing is trending across the whole EV industry.
So it's affecting both their revenue and their wholesale numbers.
Yep.
So how are they going to deal with that? I mean, are they just going to keep slashing prices?
Well, their plan is to really ramp up their global volume in 2025.
So more cars on the road.
Exactly. They think that'll help them gain market share, and that could help offset some of that pricing pressure. But they're also making these big long-term investments in battery production and developing the next generation of EV platforms.
Okay, so it sounds like they're playing the long game with Model E.
Definitely.
Which is probably the right approach in this market. Now, how about their more traditional business, Ford Blue? How are they adapting to all this change?
Well, Ford Blue, that's their division focused on those traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. And they saw pretty flat revenue for the year, mostly because of lower wholesale numbers.
Okay.
But they still managed to pull in an EBIT of $5.3 billion with a 5.2% margin.
So they're holding their own.
Yeah, but definitely facing some headwinds.
What are they doing to stay competitive?
They're working hard to reduce costs, and they're really focusing on their most profitable models like the F-Series and the Explorer.
Makes sense. Double down on what's working.
Exactly.
And lastly, how about Ford Credit, their financing arm? How did they do?
Ford Credit had a solid year. They brought in $1.7 billion in earnings before taxes. They're a really important part of Ford's overall financial stability.
They make it easier for people to buy those Fords, right?
Exactly, and that's important.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground already in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at their successes, their challenges, and most importantly, how they're reacting to this constantly changing market.
I think what's really striking is how willing Ford is to adapt.
Yeah, And they're being realistic.
They're not just chasing the latest trends.
They're making calculated moves to set themselves up for success in the long run, but we still have a lot more to unpack.
Oh, yeah.
So be sure to stick with us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll really dig into Ford's strategies and performance.
Welcome back to Talk Tickers. We just finished going over the highlights of Ford's Q4 2024 performance, and now it's time to really get into those nitty-gritty details of their strategies.
Yeah, let's get down to business. We talked about those cost reduction efforts earlier. Remember, they achieved $500 billion in savings just in the back half of 2024.
Yeah, but they're aiming for even more in 2025, like well over $1 billion, and they've got some pretty specific ideas about how to make that happen.
Okay, so break it down for us. Where are those savings going to come from?
A big focus is on improving that initial quality so they can cut down on warranty claims later on.
Makes sense.
Faster defect identification, that's key. And they're getting a lot better at fixing those defects quickly, thanks in part to those OTA updates we talked about.
Right, so it's kind of two-pronged, preventing those problems in the first place. But then if they do pop up, being able to fix them fast.
Exactly.
Now, what about material costs? Are they doing anything to tackle that?
Absolutely. They're working hand in hand with their suppliers to streamline processes, cut down on waste, and ultimately lower the cost of all those components. It's all about collaboration.
So they're really tightening up the whole supply chain.
Yeah.
What about the costs associated with design and engineering? Any progress there?
That's a big one. They've actually already implemented over $1 billion worth of design changes for their 2025 models.
Wow.
And those changes, those are going to result in some serious cost reductions over the lifespan of those vehicles.
So it's not just about those quick fixes. They're making some fundamental changes to the way they design and build these cars.
Yeah, it's a long-term strategy.
It is. Now, let's circle back to their EV game plan for a minute. They seem really optimistic about those small and medium-sized electric trucks and SUVs.
Mm-hmm.
Why are they so confident in that approach?
Well, for one thing, it aligns with what American consumers are already buying. People love their trucks and SUVs.
Right.
But it's also a pretty pragmatic way to approach this whole EV transition.
Okay, I'm curious, why is it so pragmatic?
Think about it. These vehicles are already in high demand, so you've got that built-in market.
Right.
They fit the lifestyle of a lot of families, often serving as that second car that's mainly used for, commutes and errands.
Makes sense.
And probably most importantly, they don't need those huge, expensive batteries that you find in those larger EVs.
Right. Those big batteries are a major cost factor, which is why EVs are still out of reach for a lot of buyers.
Exactly. So by focusing on smaller vehicles with smaller batteries, Ford can offer more affordable EVs, and that's going to attract a much wider range of customers.
Right. It's about making those EVs accessible.
It is. It's a volume game. They're betting on selling a ton of these vehicles at prices people can actually afford, and that could help them really dominate the EV market as it grows.
It's kind of classic Ford, isn't it? Build vehicles that people want at prices they can afford.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about those folks who want a bigger, fancier electric SUV? Are they just being left out in the cold?
Not necessarily. I mean, Ford recognizes there's a market for that segment, but they're being realistic about those affordability challenges. They're exploring some alternative options like those hybrids and ERVs we talked about.
So it's about giving people choices, options for different needs and budgets. Now, why are they so interested in those ERVs specifically?
Well, they kind of offer the best of both worlds, You get that instant torque and that silent, smooth ride of electric driving.
Right.
But you also get the range and refueling convenience of a gas engine. So it's a pretty appealing proposition for those folks who aren't quite ready to commit to a full EV, but still want to dip their toes in the water.
It does sound like a good compromise, especially for those who worry about running out of juice on the road.
Exactly.
And Ford has experience with hybrids, right?
Oh, yeah. Their hybrid F-150 has been a huge hit. It shows that people are open to these alternative powertrains.
Yeah, absolutely. So by offering a range of choices, those small, affordable EVs, larger hybrids, and these EREVs, it seems like Ford's really positioning itself well for whatever comes next in the auto market.
Yeah, they're showing that they're flexible, willing to adapt, not putting all their eggs in one basket, which is smart in an industry that's changing so fast.
Absolutely. Okay, we've talked about their efforts to cut costs. We've explored their EV strategy. What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, those investments they're making in battery production and those next-gen EV platforms, those are huge.
Yeah, they're playing the long game for sure.
They are. And those investments are going to be crucial for their success down the road.
Right. It's about building a foundation for a more sustainable future. But they're not abandoning their traditional business entirely, right?
Nope, not at all. Ford Blue, that's their legacy ICE vehicle division. They're still bringing in a good chunk of their profits. They're facing some challenges, sure, but they're actively working to reduce costs and focusing on their most profitable models.
Makes sense. So it's all about striking that balance, right? Investing in the future while also maximizing what they're doing in the present.
Yeah, exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, but they seem to be handling it pretty well.
They are, and their financial performance really reflects that. They've got a solid balance sheet, lots of cash on hand, and they're committed to rewarding their shareholders.
Yeah, that's all good news.
It is. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground in this part of our deep dive.
A lot of information.
We have, but we're not done yet.
Oh, no.
In part 3, we're going to take a closer look at how each of their segments is performing, and we'll talk about what their overall strategy means for the future of Ford. Welcome back to Talk Tickers. We spent the last 2 segments really breaking down Ford's overall performance and their strategic direction, and now it's time to put on those analyst hats and take a closer look at how each of their segments is performing.
All right, let's jump in. We can't talk about Ford's successes without giving a shout out to Ford Pro. Their commercial vehicle business is a real powerhouse.
Yeah, they're definitely exceeding expectations, especially here in North America.
Yeah.
What is the secret to their success? I mean, is it just the popularity of those Super Duty trucks and transit vans? Or are there other things at play here?
It's a pretty multifaceted approach, honestly. They've got a really strong product lineup that seems to cater to all sorts of commercial clients, from small businesses all the way up to those massive fleets.
Okay, so it's more than just having good products.
It is, yeah.
I'm listening. Tell me more.
Well, they're really smart about using their dealer network and their service capabilities to build these strong, lasting relationships with their customers.
It's not just about making that initial sale.
Right. It's about providing that ongoing support and fostering loyalty.
So it's a long-term relationship-building approach.
Exactly.
What about their push into software and services? How's that contributing to Ford Pro's success?
That's a key part of their Ford Plus strategy. Remember, they're trying to position themselves not just as a car maker, but as a mobility company.
Right, so it's about selling a whole ecosystem, not just the vehicles themselves.
Exactly. They're creating this whole world around their vehicles, offering things like telematics, fleet management, you name it. They're even doing mobile service units now.
Wow.
It's a pretty clever way to diversify their revenue streams and become less reliant on those cyclical vehicle sales.
Yeah, it's a smart move for sure.
Mhm.
Now, let's switch gears and talk about Model E, their EV division. They're facing some real challenges with pricing pressure. How are they navigating that while still trying to grow and be profitable?
Well, EVs are definitely a long game. They're pouring money into things like battery production and developing those next generation EV platforms.
Right, and those things take time to really pay off.
They do, but those investments are crucial for their future.
Okay, so they're playing the long game. But are they doing anything in the short term to, boost those margins?
They're laser focused on cutting costs, both in their manufacturing and engineering processes. And they're always looking for new battery chemistries, more efficient manufacturing processes, things that can bring those costs down even further in the future.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged attack on those costs. What about the customer experience? Are they doing anything to improve that side of things?
Oh, absolutely. They know that a happy customer is a loyal customer.
Makes sense.
Their Blue Cruise hands-free driving system is getting amazing reviews, and they're constantly adding new features and services to their EVs.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really setting themselves up for success in the long run with their EV offerings. Now, let's talk about Ford Blue. That's their legacy ICE vehicle division. They're still bringing in a good chunk of cash flow, but they're facing some challenges. How are they adapting to all the changes happening in the market?
Ford Blue is still a vital part of their business. They're really squeezing the most out of their popular trucks and SUVs, the F-Series, the Explorer, those kinds of models. But they're not just sitting back and letting things happen. They're actively working to streamline their manufacturing, reduce complexity, and improve quality.
They're not resting on their laurels.
Nope. And they're also investing in things like hybrid powertrains to improve fuel efficiency and meet those increasingly tough emission standards.
So it's about making the most of what they've got while also looking ahead to the future.
Exactly.
All right, lastly, let's touch on Ford Credit, their financing arm. How are they contributing to Ford's overall financial health?
Well, Ford Credit consistently delivers solid results.
Yeah.
They bring in those steady profits and give Ford customers access to, those financing solutions they need. They're a crucial part of the overall business model.
Yeah, they definitely keep those wheels turning. All right, so we've analyzed how Ford is performing across all its different segments, and we've gained some really valuable insights into their priorities and strategies. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I always love to get a little speculative with our "This is not financial advice" segment.
Oh, yeah, this is always fun. What crazy, but maybe not so crazy trade idea do you have for us today?
Okay, here's a thought. Ford goes all in on ERVs, like full-blown marketing blitz, positioning those ERVs as the solution for people who want that electric experience but aren't ready to give up the convenience of gas.
I like it.
Maybe they even partner up with a big energy company to offer discounts on charging and fuel.
Now you're talking.
It's a bold move, but it could really capture a huge chunk of those truck and SUV buyers who are on the fence about going full EV.
Yeah, it could be a way to bridge that gap while the EV infrastructure continues to develop.
This is all just speculation, folks. Don't go making any investment decisions based on our little brainstorming session here.
Exactly. This is not financial advice.
Do your own research. Talk to a financial advisor. You know the drill.
Always.
But it's always fun to think about the possibilities. And who knows, maybe Ford is already cooking up something like this behind closed doors.
Maybe they are. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Ford's Q4 2024 earnings call. We hope you found this episode insightful and maybe even a little bit entertaining.
We did too. This was fun.
It was. And until next time, happy investing.
Happy investing.